Imagine a Formula One car so firmly planted that corners feel less like driving and more like a slot car on a track. For decades, engineers dreamed of it, teams lost championships chasing it, and then it came roaring back. But here's the question that changes everything. What if I told you that the most grip on a modern F1 car comes not from the tires touching the ground, but from the air flowing beneath it? Today, we're unlocking ground effect and discovering why a few inches of space under your chassis can be worth tenths of a second. That gap between your car and the asphalt isn't empty space. It's a battleground where championships are won and lost. When ground effect works, a driver feels like they're glued to the track, braking later than should be possible, turning with impossible speed, and accelerating out of corners like gravity itself is helping them. Teams that master it gain an edge measured in tenths of a second per lap. And in Formula One, that's the difference between a podium and 10th place, between a title fight and also ran. That's why every top team right now is obsessed with ground effect. That's why aerodynamicists are sketching furiously on napkins and in wind tunnels around the world. Get it wrong though, and you risk instability, tire degradation, and a car that's faster on paper than it is on track. So understanding ground effect isn't just engineering nerd talk. It's the key to understanding modern Formula One itself. Let's go back to basics for a moment, because the secret to ground effect starts with something your physics teacher taught you, something called Bernoulli's principle. Imagine air flowing over a curved surface, like the top of an airplane wing. As that air speeds up, its pressure actually drops. That's not intuition, that's physics, and it's the foundation of everything we're about to explain. Now flip that idea upside down. Modern F1 cars have specially shaped tunnels running underneath the chassis. Think of them like inverted airplane wings. When the car moves forward at speed, air rushes through these tunnels, and as it accelerates, the pressure beneath the car drops dramatically. Here's where it gets beautiful. The air above the car, at normal atmospheric pressure, is now pushing down harder than the low-pressure air underneath. It's like nature itself is pressing the car into the road. That's downforce without a big wing hanging off the back. That's the ground effect in its purest form, pure aerodynamic grip, created by managing the air flowing through the bottom of the chassis. But there's a catch, and it's a delicate one. These tunnels have to work in a very specific way. The floor of the car has to be incredibly close to the ground. We're talking a few millimeters in some cases. Get it slightly wrong, and the whole system breaks down. The pressure differential collapses, and that's why you see teams obsessing over ride height, spring stiffness, and brake balance. Even tiny changes affect how the floor sits and how the air flows underneath. Now add another layer: speed. Ground effect doesn't work in a straight line the way conventional downforce does. As the car corners, the floor geometry changes its relationship to the asphalt. The tunnels twist and flex with the chassis. A driver going into a high-speed corner feels this as something almost magical. A machine that seems to defy physics, that can carry speeds through a turn that should be impossible. And that feeling is ground effect doing its job. But here's what happens on the flip side. If the car bounces, if that critical gap between the floor and the track suddenly opens up, the pressure equalizes instantly, the downforce vanishes in milliseconds. Drivers call this porpoising, and it's as violent as it sounds. The car pitches up and down in a violent rhythm. The floor crashes back down, pressure drops again, and the whole cycle repeats. It's not just uncomfortable, it can tear tires apart and make the car nearly impossible to control. That's why you've seen F1 teams in recent seasons struggling with bounce and instability, especially over bumpy tracks. They're right on the edge of ground effect, working perfectly, and it all falling apart. The engineers have to find that razor's edge, low enough to generate massive downforce, but compliant enough to survive the realities of a 70-lap race over imperfect pavement and curbs and weather changes. And that's where modern ground effect separates the championship teams from everyone else. Not just understanding the principle, but mastering the execution in a machine that's constantly changing, constantly adapting to the track beneath it. To really understand why ground effect matters, we need to look at moments when it decided not just a race, but an entire season. The clearest example comes from '2 when Mercedes finally cracked the porpoising problem that had plagued their entire grid during the winter and spring. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell were literally bouncing down straights in the opening races. Their W-Motor was quick in theory, but uncontrollable in practice. By mid-season, through sheer engineering brilliance and countless floor modifications, they found the sweet spot. Low enough for the downforce advantage, stiff enough to stay stable. When Hamilton won in Hungary and the team started climbing back toward competitiveness, it wasn't just setup changes. It was mastery of ground effect execution. That gap between first and second in aerodynamic philosophy cost them months of development and cost them a championship battle they might have won otherwise. But go back further to 2022's broader context. Every team on the grid was relearning ground effect from scratch after regulations returned to it in 2022. Red Bull, by contrast, seemed to unlock it faster than anyone. And Max Verstappen's dominance that season wasn't accidental. Their floor design, their suspension geometry, their ability to run the car low without the violent oscillations that plagued others. That was the real source of their pace advantage. Then look at 2023 and 2024. Teams like McLaren and Ferrari gradually figured out how to extract more from their own floor concepts, and suddenly they were competitive again. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri didn't suddenly become faster drivers. McLaren had simply mastered their interpretation of ground effect well enough to challenge Red Bull. It's the perfect example of how a single aerodynamic principle can determine which team dominates a generation of cars. Ground effect isn't just physics. It's the difference between a championship team and a midfield team struggling to keep their tires alive. And that's why you see teams investing millions into computational fluid dynamics, wind tunnels, Alcantara, and hundreds of hours of suspension tuning. They're not just chasing lap time in a vacuum. They're hunting for that precise operating window where downforce and stability converge, where the car is fast and drivable and reliable over 70 laps. Miss that window, and you're porpoising down the Mulsanne or losing half a second per lap over bumps at Baku. That's ground effect in the real world of modern F1, not a party trick, but the foundation of competitive machinery. Now, imagine for a moment that ground effect had never been rediscovered in '2. Picture a grid of cars running high ride heights, wide diffusers that barely work, and drivers managing porpoising by simply accepting it as part of the sport. In that alternate reality, lap times would plateau. You'd see drivers backing off in corners because the car becomes unpredictable once you push the mechanical load too far. Tire management would become even more critical than it is now, and qualifying would look radically different. But here's the thought experiment that really matters. What if one team, just one, figured out how to seal the gap between the floor and the track better than everyone else? How to lower the car safely without the violent bouncing? That team wouldn't gain 0.5 per lap. They wouldn't gain a tenth. They'd gain 1.5 seconds, maybe 2 in a single season. And suddenly, F1 would have a crisis. That's not hypothetical. That's essentially what Mercedes and Red Bull faced when they realized the new regulations were rewarding teams who mastered ground effect physics the fastest. One misstep in understanding how the pressure under the floor scales with ride height, and you're watching another team's rear wing disappear into the distance. That's how fundamental this principle is to the modern era. So here's what you need to remember. Ground effect works because low pressure underneath the car pulls it toward the track, creating grip that's almost impossible to match through conventional means. Second, the sealing of the gap between the floor and the asphalt is everything. Get it right, and you have a revolutionary advantage. Get it wrong, and you're fighting porpoising all season long. And third, this physics principle didn't just return to F1 in 2022. It fundamentally reshaped which teams would dominate the modern era. Now it's your turn. Which part of ground effect intrigues you most? Is it the aerodynamic math, the engineering solutions teams are using now, or how drivers actually feel the car working beneath them. Drop a comment below, and while you're at it, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the science that wins races.